Imagine waking up in a city where the sun is a thief, and the government insists you pay for every flicker of darkness that slips across the cobblestones. Hey folks, before we plunge into this bizarre fiscal nightmare, smash that like button like you're trying to outrun a tax collector, and drop a comment telling us the strangest bill you've ever gotten. Dim the lights, curl up with a cup of something steaming, and let the smell of wet stone and incense wash over you as we step into the imperial court of shadows. You shuffle through bustling markets, hearing the clink of copper coins as merchants whisper, "Your shade's over the limit. Pay up or face the darkness." The air hums with the sour scent of ink and fresh rain on slate, while bureaucrats in silk robes count shadows like they're counting grains of sand on a beach you can't see. Ever felt like your data plan is being taxed for every meme you watch? This ancient empire took it to the next level, so tell me in the comments, would you rather pay for your own shade or for the Wi-Fi you don't use? Sun-baked Capital Aurum glows under a low, dusty sky. Emperor Varys, with ink-stained fingers, signs a decree that every household must surrender a portion of the shadow that clings to their walls. The edict claims that darkness stores untapped energy, a resource the Empire hopes to harness. In the narrow alley behind the market, Lyra, a tax collector with steady hands, watches soot-gray dust settle on her ledger. Beside her, the scholar Cadden adjusts his spectacles, his mind already turning the decree into a question of physics. The city hums with the soft rustle of curtains being drawn back as the first day of the shadow tax begins. By midday, the streets echo with the clink of wooden boxes being hauled onto doorsteps, each labeled Shadow Levy. Mothers pause their weaving to glimpse the faint outline of light retreating from their courtyards. A subtle chill touching their skin, Lyra moves from house to house, her copper-tipped rod gently tracing the edges where light meets stone, recording lengths in a neat column. Cadden follows, noting the variance between sun-warmed bricks and cool, shaded arches, his notebook filling with half-finished equations. Murmurs rise. Some neighbors mutter that the tax is a joke. Others whisper that the empire will grow stronger from the darkness. The air grows heavier, not from heat, but from the weight of a collective uncertainty that settles like dust on the pavement. As the week passes, Lyra discovers that the shadows she measures are fickle, shrinking when clouds pass and swelling at noon, refusing to stay still. Cadden attempts to convert the recorded lengths into kilowatts, only to find the numbers dissolve into a whisper of wind through the columns. In the council hall, the emperor's advisors argue in low tones, while an unseen prophet's silhouette blurs against a sunlit tapestry, his face forever hidden by light. The irony settles like a soft sigh. The empire spends copper and ink to collect something that cannot be stored, Yet the paperwork grows taller each day. Lyra, amused despite herself, slips a small stone from her pocket into a ledger, as if to mark the absurdity with a tangible token. The day ends with the city's bells tolling a muted rhythm, the sound merging with the rustle of curtains, drawing back once more. With time, the shadow levy becomes a quiet routine, much like the morning call to prayer that once resonated through Orum's plazas. Lyra's steps grow measured. She greets each doorway with a nod, her ledger now bearing neat rows of numbers that no one reads aloud. Cadden, having set aside his equations, spends afternoons sketching the patterns of light that slip across stone walls, finding a calm in their predictability. The market stalls continue to display terracotta pots and woven baskets, the scent of cumin and baked flatbread drifting unchanged. Children play at the edge of the courtyard, their silhouettes flickering against the fading sun, unaware of the bureaucracy that once chased their shade. The empire, for a moment, feels less a machine of ambition and more a tapestry of ordinary lives stitched together by soft, unremarkable gestures. Years later, a historian leafs through Lyra's weathered ledger. The ink faded, but the rows still echo the brief fever of attacks that chased darkness. Cadden's sketches are framed in a quiet library, their gentle lines reminding visitors that knowledge sometimes rests in observing rather than commanding. The empire's archives note the decree as a footnote, a reminder that even grand aspirations can dissolve into the evening hush of ordinary days. Citizens, now older, recall the shadow levy with a half smile, their memories dimmed like the very shadows once measured. The city's walls retain the faint imprint of countless afternoons when light and dark negotiated their place. A subtle lesson in humility. In the stillness of night, the wind through Orum's arches whispers that progress is often measured not in grand victories, but in the patient acceptance of what cannot be held. When the imperial edict arrived in the dusk-hued messenger's satchels, the words about attacks on shadows slipped across the provinces like the soft falling of night. In the market squares of Veldora, the parchment was unfurled on wooden stalls, while the smell of baked rye lingered, and the clerk's quill scratched a steady rhythm. Villagers traced the ink with their fingertips, feeling the cool grain of the paper against warm skin. As the sun sank lower and long shadows stretched across the cobbles, the decree spoke of measuring each household's darkness and collecting a modest portion for the treasury, a notion as strange as it was quiet. Yet the air held a faint tension, like the breath before a gentle storm, as people turned their heads toward the looming silhouette of the imperial tower. By the next sunrise, murmurs rose from fields where wheat swayed in amber The shadow tax moved like a slow river through the valley. Lyra, whose hands were still damp with dew from morning chores, watched farmers gather beneath the ancient oak, their faces set against the cool morning mist. When the tax collector's men arrived, their boots stirring dust, the farmers placed their tools down and stared at the ground, refusing to hand over the faint silhouettes that cooled their crops at night. The clink of metal coins against ledger pages was replaced by the rustle of straw, and the low, steady hum of tension that settled over the rows. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if listening to the quiet defiance woven into the fabric of everyday labor. Amid the growing unrest, Cadden slipped into the ruins of the old library, where the scent of cracked parchment mingled with the faint aroma of sandalwood from centuries old incense. There, among dust-coated scrolls, he uncovered a forgotten treatise that described shadows as the natural breath of stone and leaf, not a commodity to be measured. The text, written in a hand whose author's face was forever hidden by the dim candlelight, argued that darkness belongs to the world itself, a silent companion to both sunrise and sunset. When the imperial enforcers finally pressed the village square, their swords gleamed coldly, but the farmers stood firm, holding their shadows like invisible shields. The clash was more a quiet shuffling of feet on earth than a roar of battle, each side aware of the absurdity that attacks could reach into the very shade that fell over their backs. After the sun slipped behind the hills, the sounds of conflict faded into the soft murmur of crickets, and the village settled into a hushed evening. Lanterns flickered, casting warm, amber pools on wooden tables where Lyra and her neighbors shared simple stew, the steam rising like thin clouds against the night air. The enforcers, their armor now dull under the moonlight, retreated slowly, their boots leaving faint prints that the wind soon erased. In the quiet, Cadden placed the ancient scroll on a low table, its pages catching the gentle glow, and the villagers listened as he spoke of shadows as gifts rather than taxes. The night wrapped the scene in a comfortable coolness, the kind that invites thoughts to settle like dust on an old shelf. When dawn brushed the horizon with pale gold, the people of the valley walked back to their fields, each step measured and steady, as if carrying the memory of the night's quiet lesson. Lyra brushed the dew from the barley stalks, feeling the soft play of light and shade dance across the grains, a reminder that darkness belongs to the earth, not the ledger. Cadden returned the scroll to the library, its leather cover warm from handling, and closed the door with a gentle click that resonated like a sigh. The Empire, hearing of the villagers' gentle resistance, sent a new decree that simply acknowledged shadows as natural, leaving the tax unheard and uncollected. In the end, the story settled into the slow rhythm of everyday life, a subtle reminder that human imperfection often finds its balance in the quiet spaces between authority and ordinary breath. In the waning light of the empire's capital, the edicts that demanded a levy on every citizen's shadow hung like dust on the marble walls of the treasury, a notion both absurd and earnest. Lyra, a courier with ink-stained fingertips, heard the murmurs of market stalls that whispered of a hidden exchange where shadows slipped through unseen cracks. She walked past the clogged alleys, feeling the cool breath of night against her cheek as the city settled into a sigh. The tax collectors, their ledgers heavy with numbers, paced the streets with a solemn rhythm, unaware of the quiet rebellion brewing beneath the moon. Yet the streets themselves seemed to hold a secret, a pulse that grew louder as the dusk deepened, inviting curiosity and caution alike. Lyra felt the weight of the empire's gaze, a silent invitation to see what lay beyond the official record. One night, guided by the faint glow of lanterns hung low on weathered beams, Lyra slipped into the narrow passage that opened onto the night market, a tapestry of muted stalls where the air smelled of roasted barley and damp stone. The market breathed in hushed tones, vendors offering small vials that captured stolen shadows, their hands trembling as they passed the darkness like a fragile coin. Around her, the crowd moved with a careful choreography, eyes darting, lips barely parting, as auditors in cloaked robes tried to trace the invisible threads of commerce. A sudden clatter of metal against a wooden crate broke the lull, and Lyra's heart quickened, sensing the imminent confrontation between law and livelihood. The auditor's quills scratched uneasy notes, while the merchants exchanged silent glances, aware that any misstep could invite the empire's unforgiving glare. The tension hung heavier than the night air, a palpable pressure that seemed to thicken the shadows themselves. From the shadows emerged Lady Noctis, her veil a weave of midnight silk that seemed to drink the surrounding light, and she greeted Lyra with a smile that held both weariness and gentle amusement. She explained that darkness was not a commodity to be taxed, but a shield that people wrapped around their hopes when the sun proved too bright, an irony the empire failed to comprehend in its ledgers of gold and grain. With a steady hand, she poured a vial of midnight into Lyra's palm, letting the coolness spread like a whispered promise across her skin. The auditors, now surrounded by a hush, watched as the market's rhythm resumed, the sound of barter continuing as if nothing had shifted, while the tax records in their tents remained stubbornly blank. Lady Noctis's words lingered like the scent of rain on stone, suggesting that the true wealth of the night lay in the uncountable moments of shared silence. Lyra sensed the subtle triumph of a people who learned to turn the empire's absurd decree into a quiet act of defiance. The market settled into its familiar cadence, lanterns flickering in a soft amber that painted faces with a gentle, sleepy glow, while the scent of fresh bread mingled with the faint metallic tang of stolen night. Vendors passed small, dark parcels to mothers cradling infants, the exchange measured not in coin, but in the reassurance of a shadow that could dim the harsh glare of authority. Lyra moved among them, fingertips brushing the cool surface of a vial, feeling the subtle pressure of anticipation dissolve into a comforting calm. Children laughed quietly, their voices muffled by the night wind, as they chased phosphorescent fireflies that seemed to echo the market's own fleeting dance. Even the auditors, their ledgers now closed, lingered by the periphery, their eyes reflecting a mix of resignation and quiet admiration for the resilience they witnessed. The atmosphere held a steady warmth, as if the very air had been stitched together with the soft threads of ordinary endurance. When dawn hinted at the horizon, the auditors retreated to their chambers, their parchment stained with ink that could not capture the weight of the phantom economy they had observed. They found that the shadows traded beneath the moon left no trace in the empire's ledgers. Yet their presence lingered in the empty spaces between numbers, a reminder that some wealth is measured only by felt experience. Lady Noctis vanished as the first light touched the rooftops, leaving behind a lingering scent of night jasmine, and the subtle lesson that control over the unseen often slips through the finest fingers. Lyra, now carrying a quiet certainty, walked back through the waking streets, the cool imprint of midnight still tingling at the edge of her skin. She reflected on how the empire's attempt to tax the intangible had uncovered a deeper, unspoken agreement among its people, a pact to shelter one another in darkness when daylight grew too harsh. In the lingering silence of the morning, the city exhaled, its history gently turning a page that embraced both absurdity and the quiet dignity of human survival. In the low summer of the 11th year of Emperor Varys, the capital's stone streets still carried the faint scent of rain on sun-warmed tiles, while clerks whispered about a new decree that would tax every citizen's shadow at sunrise. The tax was recorded in ink that smelled of iron, and the officials measured darkness with brass gauges that clicked softly against the courtyard walls. Lyra, a mid-level scribe whose hands were accustomed to the weight of ledgers, noted the absurdity while the market noise faded into a distant murmur. Children pressed their faces against the shutters, watching the sky darken as the distant horizon promised a rare solar eclipse. The city, accustomed to the steady rhythm of bureaucracy, felt a subtle shift in the air, as if the sun itself were pausing to listen. When the eclipse was announced, quiet meetings formed in narrow alleys where the scent of baked bread mingled with the cool draft from open doors. Workers gathered around oil lamps, their flickering light casting elongated silhouettes that seemed to whisper of a shared purpose. The plan was simple. At the moment the moon swallowed the sun, the city would halt all activity, letting the imposed darkness become a collective protest. Lyra felt the pulse of anticipation rise in her chest, a calm that steadied her breath as the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer marked the passing hours. The tension gathered like low clouds, waiting for the precise instant when light would withdraw. As the eclipse reached its apex, a sudden hush fell over the capital. The sun's disk vanished, and the streets were bathed in a muted twilight that felt both ordinary and uncanny. Emperor Varys, seated in the marble hall of the palace, issued an urgent edict to seize every lingering shadow, ordering soldiers to capture the intangible with nets woven of silver thread. Yet the rebels, armed with lanterns they had crafted from reclaimed darkness, small glass vessels that held the residual gloom of the eclipse, moved like whispers through the corridors. The guards, accustomed to enforcing paperwork, stumbled over the soft, cool air that seemed to cling to their boots. Their expressions, a mix of confusion and sleepy resolve. The irony lay in the fact that the Empire's attempt to own absence only deepened the citizens' embrace of the void. The blackout held longer than any official timetable, and the palace courtyard filled with the gentle rustle of fabrics as people gathered, their faces illuminated by the gentle glow of the lanterns. Guards, now more like tired attendants, lowered their spears and listened to the faint chorus of distant drums that marked the rhythm of the uprising. Lyra stood at the edge of the crowd, feeling the cool stone beneath her feet and the faint warmth of the ember light on her cheeks, while the city around her exhaled a collective sigh. The Emperor's voice, muffled through thick stone walls, finally faded into the background, replaced by the soft murmur of ordinary chatter about food, family, and the strange comfort of shared shade. In that stillness, the capital seemed to settle into an uneasy peace, as if the eclipse had drawn a veil over the usual clamor of authority. When the sun returned, spilling amber across the rooftops and painting the streets with the familiar gold of day, Lyra faced a quiet crossroads between her sworn duties and the newfound truth that light and shade could coexist without being owned. She could return to the ledger room, her fingers tracing the lines of taxation, or she could walk toward the courtyard where the lanterns shrines still glowed softly, their shadows dancing lightly on the walls. The choice felt like the gentle turning of a page, neither dramatic nor tragic, but marked by a slow, reflective acceptance of humanity's imperfect balance. As a gentle breeze carried the scent of drying wheat through the open windows, Lyra lifted her gaze to the sky, noting how the lingering twilight lingered in her mind, even as the world brightened. In that moment, the Empire's ambition to tax shadows seemed as fleeting as the eclipse itself, leaving behind only the quiet lesson that some things are meant to be felt, not measured. At first light, the marble courtyards of the capital stirred with the soft clatter of sandals, and the thin air carried the faint scent of damp stone. Veres, whose robes had long brushed the marble steps, stepped back from the throne with a quiet sigh, his hand lingering on the cool rail before turning away. Murmurs rose like distant wind through the colonnades. As the council sensed the shift, the sunlight spilling amber across the arches. Cadden and Lyra, eyes fixed on the pale floor, felt the weight of centuries in the hush that followed the abdication. The Empire, long accustomed to measuring every shade, now faced a day without a decree on shadows. The council gathered beneath a vaulted ceiling, where the echo of footsteps sounded like muted rain, each member tracing the edge of a wooden table with a fingertip still warm from the morning sun. Cadden, his beard brushed by a gentle draft, spoke of shadows as a communal trust, his voice low enough to mingle with the rustle of parchment. Lyra, adjusting the hem of her linen tunic, noted the chill that lingered where light fell short, reminding the assembly that darkness had always been a quiet partner to labor. Tension rose in the space between their words, a subtle tightening of shoulders as scribes paused their ink, the room holding its breath like a field waiting for a harvest wind. Yet the council's resolve settled like dust on stone, steady and unhurried. When the earlier tax collectors attempted to catalog shadows, their ledgers grew thin as the dusk that slipped through the shutters, and their attempts proved as futile as trying to catch wind in a palm. The irony lay in the way the shadows slipped around the heavy boots, sliding across floorboards with a soft sigh that no clerk could record. Laughter, restrained and almost imperceptible, flickered among the youngest members, their eyes reflecting the faint outline of twilight that refused to be taxed. The absurdity of counting something that refused to stay still reminded everyone that some edges of life were meant to remain unbounded. The council watched the play of light and shade with a calm that seemed to acknowledge the universe's quiet sense of humor. When the law was finally read aloud, the parchment crackled like dry leaves, and the words settled into the courtyard with a gentle gravity. Shadows were declared a shared trust, free to drift wherever stone and timber allowed, untethered from any levy. The sun softened its glare, casting a mellow glow that warmed the stone benches where workers rested, their hands steady on worn tools. In the marketplaces, merchants paused their trade to feel the coolness of shadow at noon, smiling at the simple relief it offered. Life resumed its ordinary rhythm, now tinged with the quiet assurance that darkness, like a familiar friend, would always be there without a price tag. Years later, the city's walls bore the faint patina of countless evenings, each one a reminder of the balance that had been chosen. Residents recalled the night fairies stepped down as a soft lullaby, the council's decision echoing like a distant drumbeat in the background of daily chores. Children traced the edge of a shadow with their fingertips, feeling the subtle temperature change, while elders whispered about the peace that followed the relinquishment of control. History, in its patient scroll, noted the moment with a restrained reverence, noting that the empire learned that some gifts are best left untouched. In the quiet of the dusk, the empire rested, its lights and shadows in harmonious dialogue, a gentle lesson for those who would listen. In the luminous capital of Luminara, the marble facade of the council hall caught the late afternoon sun, spilling a warm amber onto the polished floor. King Eric the Pragmatic rose from his oak chair, his sleeves brushed with faint dust from countless petitions. He spoke in a measured cadence about a new decree. Every citizen must record the content of their nightly dreams and submit a modest tax on the most wondrous visions. The chamber, filled with scribes and merchants, listened with a quiet rustle of parchment. The proclamation promised wealth for the kingdom and order for the restless mind, as if sorting whispers could steady the tide of imagination. A faint sigh of anticipation lingered, like the soft exhale of a candle flame. The council members exchanged glances, the ink on their cuffs smudging as they shifted. Outside, market stalls creaked under the weight of woven baskets, and a baker's oven emitted a steady, comforting heat, while the notion of taxing dreams felt oddly cold. Some citizens whispered that nightfall would become a ledger, their private wanderings measured in coin, and a murmur of unease settled over the courtyard. The royal scribe, a wiry man with calloused fingertips, began drafting forms that asked for colors, sounds, and emotions, as if a dream could be catalogued in neat rows. A lone child tugged at his mother's shawl, asking why the moon should be taxed, and the mother answered with a weary smile that concealed both affection and fatigue. The tension lingered like a thin fog, neither clearing nor thickening, merely present. Weeks later, the first dream registers arrived, penned on vellum with trembling script, describing a garden where lilies sang and rain fell upward. Tax collectors examined the verses with solemn faces, their eyes sliding over the words as if seeking hidden gold within metaphors. The officials assigned a modest levy to the most vivid imagery, noting that a dream of flying silver fish warranted a higher fee than one of ordinary rain. The kingdom's treasury swelled modestly, yet the public chuckled in taverns, comparing the absurdity of counting clouds to counting grain. In the palace kitchen, a cook quietly noted that his night of dreaming about endless feasts earned him a single copper, a detail that spread through the corridors with a soft, amused ripple. The irony settled like a warm blanket, comforting yet subtly reminding everyone that even grand intentions could be reduced to petty arithmetic. Over months, the dream tax became a routine ritual. Citizens placed their written visions in wooden boxes beside the city well, and clerks stamped each entry with a quiet, practiced thud. The sound of parchment rustling blended with the distant murmur of the river, forming a background hum that matched the steady rhythm of daily life. Children grew accustomed to sketching their nocturnal wanderings before bedtime, while elders filed their recollections with a patient hand, their faces illuminated by the waning light of oil lamps. The kingdom's markets continued to barter, the scent of spices and fresh bread undisturbed, as the tax revenue subtly funded repairs to the aging aqueducts. Even the king, seated in his garden as twilight cooled the marble steps, watched the soft glow of lanterns and felt a gentle satisfaction that the law had settled into the fabric of Luminara without uprooting its quiet heart. A calm acceptance settled over the city, like dust settling on a long-used table. Decades later, historians would leaf through the faded ledgers, noting the precise amounts paired with the fanciful dream descriptions, and would smile at the peculiar marriage of imagination and bureaucracy. They observed that the tax had never altered the shape of a citizen's night, but had offered a shared language for expressing wonder, a communal archive of collective yearning. The archive, stored in a cool stone room, now gathered dust, its pages yellowed but still readable, reminding scholars that attempts to control the unseen often become quiet testimonies rather than oppressive edicts. In quiet lectures, teachers would recount the dream weaver's decree, highlighting how the kingdom learned that even the most intangible parts of humanity can be respected through gentle structure rather than harsh restriction. The story lingered in the evening air of Luminara, a soft echo that encouraged future generations to cherish their nightly voyages, while acknowledging the modest cost of remembering them. And the city, bathed in the amber of a setting sun, continued to breathe calmly, as if the very act of dreaming had always been its most honest tax. In the waning light of early autumn, the kingdom's capital hummed with the soft clatter of market stalls as the dream weavers, led by the enigmatic sage Myra, announced a new register for nightly visions. Their parchment ledger, tucked beneath the high arched windows of the royal archives, was to be filled by any citizen who could recall the shape of a dream upon waking. The decree was read aloud by a clerk, whose voice barely rose above the rustle of silk, and the people listened while stirring shallow soups and polishing copper pots. From the courtyard, the scent of pine smoke drifted, mingling with the distant chant of a lone lute. Myra's eyes, hidden behind a veil of muted amber light, hinted at a quiet determination that felt more like curiosity than authority. Soon the streets whispered of the new tax, and an uneasy murmur spread through the narrow alleys where artisans mended cloth and potters turned clay. A baker paused mid-knead, eyes flicking to the ledger that now rested on his table, while a weaver paused her shuttle, feeling the weight of unseen scrutiny behind the tavern's low-brimmed doors. Small circles gathered in candlelight, sharing fragments of dreamscapes, as if exchanging recipes, each voice low enough not to stir the palace's watchful ears. The murmurs grew into a quiet chorus of dissent, their cadence matching the steady tick of the town clock. Even the stone fountains seemed to sigh, their water flowing slower, as if reluctant to carry away the unsettled thoughts. Yet the royal scribes continued to mark each entry, their quills scratching a rhythm that felt increasingly out of step with the people's breath. Irony settled like dust on the marble floors of the council hall, for the very act of measuring imagination seemed to warp the night itself. Farmers reported sharper, jagged visions of barren fields where once soft clouds had floated, while the seamstress described a relentless chase of shadowed figures that stole the colors from her fabrics. The tax, intended as a gentle stream of tribute, became a subtle current that tugged at the edges of waking life, turning idle reverie into restless wakefulness. Even Myra, whose face remained obscured by the shifting glow of a lantern, noted the rise in complaints with a barely perceptible sigh. The kingdom's air grew cooler, the evenings longer, as though the collective unrest had drawn a thin veil over the moon's comforting glow. Amid the growing unease, a young shepherd named Kian slipped away from his flock at dusk, his wool-capped head inclined toward the hills where the wind whispered through the grasses. He found the artisan's secret circle tucked beneath an old olive tree, their hands stained with pigment and soot, their voices soft as the rustle of wool. Together they spoke of a shared fatigue, and Kian, whose own dreams had become tangled nightmares of endless pastures, suggested a petition to the dream weavers, proposing instead a voluntary exchange of stories for communal benefit. The mystics, their cloaks draped in muted earth tones, added quiet verses that spoke of balance, their faces blurred by the flickering firelight. Over steaming tea, the group drafted a modest charter, its parchment creased from careful folding, and placed it upon the steps of the palace with the gentle thud of a shepherd's staff. The night settled around them, a cool breath that carried the scent of lavender and distant rain. As the first draft waited to be read, when the charter reached Myra's hands, the scribes paused, their quills hovering above the ink, as if considering the weight of the paper. The sage, whose features remained hidden behind a veil of stone-gray shadow, read the gentle plea and felt the faint echo of a long-forgotten lullaby in its lines. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom observed a subtle shift. The ledger remained, but entries were now offered voluntarily, each dream recorded with a sigh of relief rather than a sting of duty. The people returned to their work with quieter steps, the market stalls humming as before, while the night reclaimed its softness, allowing dreams to drift like amber leaves on a calm stream. History would later note this episode as a quiet reminder that the most fragile of taxes are those placed upon imagination, and that even a kingdom can learn to listen to the hush between breaths. In the low light of the kingdom's courtyard, King Eric announced a new levy that would count each citizen's night wandering as taxable revenue. And the murmurs of the gathered crowd settled like dust on stone. The decree was read aloud by a clerk whose fingers traced the inked parchment with a steady, deliberate motion. And the air tingled with a faint coppery scent of parchment and candle wax. Villagers watched as the royal seal was pressed, the embossed emblem catching the evening glow, and a quiet sense of inevitability settled over the stone houses that lined the market lane. Children, clutching simple wooden toys, glanced up at the banners fluttering with the king's emblem, unaware that their fantasies were now measured in coin. The night wardens, cloaked in muted gray, stood at the edges, their boots muffled against the cobblestones, ready to enforce the new order. Weeks turned into a rhythm of whispers and shudders as the night wardens began to patrol the narrow alleys, their lanterns casting thin, amber pools that barely illuminated the faces of those they questioned. When a baker's wife was caught dreaming of a feast beyond the kingdom's borders, the wardens escorted her to a dim cell where the stone walls seemed to absorb the echo of her sigh. The scent of damp stone mixed with the faint smell of wool from the guards' uniforms, and the clink of iron keys punctuated the night like distant raindrops. Families gathered around small wooden tables, the soft scrape of cutlery against plates a reminder of ordinary life persisting under the weight of the tax. Yet a quiet tension grew, as the once comforting darkness now felt like a ledger being tallied, each shadow an entry waiting to be recorded. Amid the growing unease, Cayenne and Myra, two apprentices to the kingdom's archivist, uncovered an old vellum tucked behind a loose stone in the cellar of the great hall. Its script faded, but still legible in the candlelight. The prophecy spoke of a realm that would harvest the night's wonder, only to be devoured by its own darkness. Its words spoken by a voice whose face was forever blurred by the swirl of dust motes and shifting shadows. They read the verses aloud, the soft rustle of parchment echoing against the cool stone floor, while a lone moth fluttered lazily past the flickering flame. Their discovery was met with a calm acceptance, as if the ancient warning had simply joined the hum of everyday chores. The night wardens passed by, their boots making a muted thud, unaware that the very ink they counted could unravel their purpose. The following mornings unfolded in a measured cadence, the kingdom's workshops humming with the steady clank of metal and the gentle swish of looms, each sound a reminder that life continued despite the imposed tax. Cayenne and Myra presented the prophecy to the council in a modest stone chamber, the room warmed by sunlight filtering through narrow windows, casting long, soft shadows across the wooden benches. Their words floated in the still air, and a quiet chuckle escaped from an elder clerk, the sound barely disturbing the faint scent of parchment and tea. The council members, robes rustling softly as they shifted, listened without haste, their faces half hidden by the play of light and shadow, embodying the blurred visage the prophecy described. In the background, the night wardens paused at the doorway, their eyes lingering on the quiet determination of the apprentices before they resumed their orderly march. As months slipped by, the tax on dreams faded like a sigh in the wind, the night wardens easing their patrols as the kingdom sensed a subtle shift in its own heartbeat. Families once wary of the night now gathered under open skies, the cool air brushing their cheeks, while they shared simple stories that sprouted like small plants in fertile soil. The stone walls of the prisons grew damp with moss, and the distant clang of iron keys grew rarer, a reminder of the transience of enforced order. Cayenne and Myra, now older, watched the sunrise paint the terracotta roofs with a gentle orange hue, feeling the quiet irony of a kingdom that once tried to tax the intangible, now finding comfort in ordinary moments. In the soft hush of evening, the kingdom settled into a reflective stillness, its people cradled by the unmeasured rhythm of dreams. Once again, in the low, amber light of early evening, the kingdom that tried to tax dreams kept its streets orderly. the cobblestones still warm from the day's traffic, and the scent of river bread lingering in the air. King Eric's decree, inked on parchment and sealed with a modest sigil, required every citizen to surrender a fragment of a night's reverie to the palace's dream weaver. A crystal repository that glimmered like frozen dew. The decree was announced from the town square, where the clatter of wooden carts softened under the hush of listening villagers. Some murmured in the alleyways, hands brushing the rough stone walls, while others brushed dust from their sleeves, uneasy at the thought of measuring something as intangible as a dream. Yet the kingdom continued its routine, each dusk closing like a quiet sigh over the market stalls, as if the law were another ordinary thread in the fabric of daily life. One moonless night, the lanterns along the main boulevard flickered, their flames trembling against the cold, damp wind that carried the faint scent of pine from the nearby forest. Cayenne, a quiet mason with hands scarred from shaping stone, gathered a small crowd of those who had felt their nights growing barren, their eyes reflecting the dim glow of oil lamps. He moved slowly, his steps echoing on the flagstones, while the murmured footfalls of the dream-free citizens formed a soft rhythm that rose like a low tide. The palace gates, usually guarded by solemn stone statues, seemed to sigh open as the procession approached, the iron hinges creaking in a sound that reminded them of distant thunder. The tension settled like a low hum, the air thick with the unspoken question of what would happen when ordinary people entered the vaulted halls of authority. Inside the throne room, the dream weaver's crystal archive stood on a raised dais, its facets catching the faint lantern light and scattering it into a barely perceptible shimmer, like dewdrops caught in a winter sunrise. Cayenne, with a steady hand, lifted a sturdy wooden beam and struck the crystal, sending a resonant crack through the stone walls that felt as gentle as a sigh, yet carried the weight of collective yearning. The crystal shattered, releasing a cascade of uncollected dreams that rose like a soft, luminous mist, curling around the vaulted ceiling in slow, swirling eddies. The mist breathed a faint, warm glow, its colors shifting from muted lavender to pale gold, filling the chamber with an atmosphere that felt both fragile and intoxicating. The irony lay in the dream's quiet rebellion, a quiet storm that was more a soft illumination than a violent upheaval, reminding the royal court that even measured policies could not contain the subtle currents of human imagination. The luminous storm settled over the throne, its gentle light bathing King Eric in a wash of amber that softened the lines of his crown and illuminated the quiet resignation in his eyes. The king, seated upon a seat of oak worn smooth by generations, felt the cool dampness of the dream mist settle on his shoulders like a shawl, each droplet a reminder of the lives that had been quietly catalogued. He rose slowly, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath his weight, and placed his hand upon the empty pedestal where the crystal once stood, feeling the faint echo of the dreams that had escaped. The court, a collection of robes and muted expressions, watched in subdued silence as the king spoke in a low, measured tone, acknowledging the unintended consequences of his decree without a hint of anger. The room, now illuminated by the soft glow of residual dream light, seemed to exhale, the tension easing into a calm that felt as inevitable as a river finding its path after a storm. In the days that followed, the kingdom's streets returned to their familiar rhythm, the scent of fresh loaves and the rustle of parchment resuming their place in everyday life. King Eric, now more aware of the delicate balance between governance and the intangible, reordered his archives, opting to document dreams only when citizens offered them willingly. A quiet concession that felt like a gentle adjustment of a well-worn tapestry. The citizens, their nights once again filled with private reveries, walked past the palace with a soft smile, the memory of the luminous storm lingering like a faint perfume on the breeze. Historians would later note the episode as a modest lesson in humility, a reminder that even the most measured policies can be disturbed by the quiet persistence of human imagination. As the evening lanterns dimmed each night, the kingdom settled into a steady cadence, its history humming low and steady, like a lullaby that acknowledges both the weight of rule and the softness of dreams. In the spring of the 3rd year of King Eric's reign, a council of scribes unfurled a parchment announcing a new levy, a tax on the nightly visions that visited each citizen. The decree was read aloud in the marble courtyard, its words echoing against the stone walls as a gentle breeze lifted the dust over the market stalls. Traders paused their barter, the baker's hands still warm from kneading dough, while mothers cradled swaddling cloths and wondered how a dream could be measured. The royal seal, pressed into the ink, glimmered under the pale morning light, its authority both reassuring and unsettling. Yet the people filed away the notice, filing it among other obligations, as the kingdom continued its quiet hum of daily life. Soon the tax collectors, cloaked in muted brown cloaks, began to appear at dusk, their sandals brushing the soft grass of the village lanes. They knocked on wooden doors, asking for a tally of nocturnal wanderings, the question hanging like a cold draught in the warm hearthrooms. A low murmur rose from the hearths, the clink of cups, the sigh of shutters, voices low as they whispered about the absurdity of counting what drifted unseen. Children pressed their ears to the cracked windows, hearing the distant hoot of an owl, while their mothers whispered lullabies that seemed suddenly heavy. The weight of the levee settled like a faint chill, though the night sky remained unchanged, its stars indifferent to human accounting. As weeks turned, the ledgers of the taxmen grew thin, their columns filled with empty scribbles where dream accounts should have been. The ink bled into the paper like rain on parchment. The king's advisers, their faces blurred by the dim torchlight, reported the futility with a quiet resignation that carried a hint of ironic amusement. The market square, once bustling, now hosted a quiet demonstration of people sharing whispered stories of their dreams without a single coin changing hands. A figure, perhaps a prophet or a philosopher, stood at the edge of the crowd, his features concealed by the shadow of his hood, his voice barely audible over the rustle of night fabrics. The irony settled like a soft dust over the kingdom, a tax on something that could not be held, measured, or stored, had become a lesson in the limits of rule. When the sun rose on a calm dawn, King Eric ascended the stone balcony, his hands resting on the cool rail as he addressed the assembled townsfolk with a steady, unhurried tone. He declared the tax void, his words moving like a warm breeze through the courtyard, and announced the creation of a sanctuary where dreams would be spoken freely, not measured nor taxed. The sanctuary, built from reclaimed timber and sun-warmed stone, opened its doors to the sound of soft footsteps, the rustle of woven tapestries, and the faint scent of lavender drifting from nearby gardens. Residents gathered inside, laying their heads on cushioned benches, sharing fragments of night adventures as the candlelight flickered gently. The atmosphere settled into a tranquil rhythm, the kingdom breathing easily once more beneath a sky unburdened by fiscal chains. Years later, the sanctuary's courtyard became a familiar silhouette against the amber glow of evening, its walls marked by the faint scratches of countless hands that had rested there. Luminara's streets hummed with ordinary chores, bakers kneading dough, potters shaping clay, children drawing chalk circles on cobblestones, each person moving with a measured calm that seemed to echo the earlier lesson. Nighttime fell with a soft hush. The people slipped into sleep, their breath steady, the only sound the distant croak of a night jar perched on the wall. The kingdom's history was recorded in modest ledgers that spoke not of taxes, but of shared stories, of a community that chose generosity over greed. In the quiet reflection of the lantern-lit sanctuary, the lingering sense was one of subtle gratitude for a dream that remained a gift, untouched by commerce, and forever part of the gentle pulse of human life. In the marble-clad capital of Lyrantes, the high arches of the Forum caught the soft amber of late afternoon. The council of voices, gathered beneath a vaulted ceiling, pronounced the silent edict, forbidding any whispered secret to pass the lips of a citizen. From that moment, a new office was created. The keeper of silence, a figure draped in muted gray, whose sole task was to listen for the faintest breath of unapproved murmur. Young Archivist Cellini, ink-stained fingers still wet from cataloging the city's histories, watched the proclamation from the shadowed balcony of the archive. Veteran soldier Darius, armor dulled by years of patrol, stood at the edge of the marble stair, feeling the weight of the law settle like dust on his shoulders. The city's market, normally a chorus of haggling voices, fell into a tentative hush as merchants folded their stalls tighter around their wares. A baker bent over a loaf felt the heat of the oven, but heard no gossip about the rising dough, only the soft clink of copper coins. Children, accustomed to sharing secret games in the alleys, now whispered to themselves, their breath barely stirring the air. Even the fountain in the central square seemed to hold its spray, its water gliding silently over the stone, as if fearing to be overheard. Cellini noted each pause in the ledger, the sudden absence of marginal notes that once captured whispered testimonies. Darius, patrolling the quiet streets, sensed the tension in the way doors closed a fraction sooner, the rustle of fabric pausing before a greeting. The keeper of silence arrived at the marketplace in a plain white tunic, his sandals making barely a sound on the packed earth. He surveyed the crowd with eyes that never lingered, and yet a faint smile curved his lips when a vendor offered him a warm loaf without a word. People soon learned to replace whispers with gestures. A nod, a pressed hand, a shared glance that conveyed more than any hushed confession could. Ironically, the absence of spoken secrets made the city's small jokes louder in the mind, as citizens imagined the forbidden words and laughed silently to themselves. Cellini, watching from the arches, recorded the new choreography of communication, feeling a quiet amusement stir beneath her careful prose. Months slipped by, and the silent edict settled into the rhythm of everyday life like the steady tick of a distant clock. The streets grew accustomed to the soft shuffle of sandals and the muted clatter of carts, the noises now measured and deliberate. Even the council chambers, once echoing with heated debate, now resonated with the rustle of parchment and the measured tapping of quill pens. Darius found his patrols easier, his boots finding steady footing on pathways no longer punctuated by startled shouts. Cellini's archive filled with clean columns, each entry a plain statement of fact, devoid of the hidden asides that had once colored the records. The keeper of silence, having fulfilled his duty, retreated to a quiet courtyard where the wind brushed the stone. His presence, a reminder that absence can be a kind of order. In an evening after the market had closed, Selene and Darius met at the edge of the river, the water reflecting the dim lanterns like a soft mirror. They spoke in clear tones, aware that their words now formed part of the sanctioned record, each syllable weighed with the patience of history. Darius whispered to the night sky about the strange comfort found in restraint, his voice barely stirring the air. Selene closed the latest ledger, feeling a gentle melancholy for the secrets that would never be recorded, yet also gratitude for the calm that settled over the city. The city slept beneath a blanket of quiet, its citizens cradled by the very silence that once had seemed a punishment, now a soft, enduring lull. In the early light of the central market, the Republic's stone arches cast long, warm shadows over stalls of dried figs and cracked pottery, while the air held the dry scent of dust and cooked lentils. Selene moved between awnings, her hands brushing the cool fabric of a merchant's cloak as she examined a basket of copper coins. The Republic's decree against whispered secrets was displayed on a faded banner, its letters blunt and unadorned, reminding every passerby that silence was a civic duty. Around her, women haggled over the weight of olives. Children chased each other with chalk-dusted shoes, and the murmur of ordinary barter formed a steady rhythm. Even the occasional distant footfall seemed measured, as if the very stones respected the law of quiet. Yet beneath the surface of the market's calm, a subtle ripple began to spread like a slow tide, tinged with the faint scent of jasmine from a hidden garden stall. Selene caught a fleeting glance of a nervous trader, lowering his voice to a near whisper as he passed a wicker basket, his eyes darting toward a narrow doorway behind the spice vendor. The hum of conversation grew uneven, as if a wind had slipped through a cracked window, carrying fragments of a story about a lost ledger hidden in the town hall. A vendor swore softly, his fingers trembling on the rough wood of his counter, while a child paused, ears perked, before resuming his game of marbles. The market, usually a stage of open exchange, now seemed to hold its breath in small, uneasy pockets. It was there, in that tentative hush, that Selene discovered a cluster of murmurers who traded in hushed truths as if they were ordinary wares, their hands passing folded notes beneath the rustle of burlap sacks. Their faces were deliberately turned away, the light catching only the shadows of their brows, keeping any prophetic figure blurred and undefined. The irony lay in the quiet commerce. A society that outlawed whispers now fostered a covert market where secrets were bartered like spices, each transaction sealed with a soft exhale. Selene watched a woman barter a rumor about a distant harvest for a sack of barley, the exchange punctuated by the gentle clink of copper tokens. The scene was both absurd and tender, a reminder that even in enforced silence, humans find a way to speak. With the afternoon sun mellowing to a honeyed amber, Selene steadied her stance, feeling the weight of her republic's oath against the pull of curiosity. She lingered near the murmurers, the cool stone of the archway resting against her back, observing the careful choreography of glances and nods. The market continued unabated. Cooks stirred simmering stews. A potter's hands dusted clay with deliberate patience, and distant laughter echoed from the tavern's doorway. Selene's own breath fell into a measured rhythm, matching the subtle pulse of the crowd as she quietly catalogued each whispered fragment that slipped through the stalls. In this calm, the tension eased, not by resolution, but by the simple acceptance of coexistence between law and the human penchant for soft rebellion. As dusk settled, painting the terracotta roofs with a gentle violet hue, Selene lingered near the edge of the market, the cool evening air brushing against her cheeks. She reflected on the paradox of a republic that outlawed whispers yet could not silence the human need to share unnoticed truths, noting how the market itself seemed to exhale a collective sigh of endurance. The murmurers vanished into the winding alleys, their secrets lingering like the faint aroma of incense, while the vendors packed their stalls, their hands still warm from the day's labor. Selene's heart settled into a quiet rhythm, aware that history often records the grand gestures, but forgets the soft murmur of everyday courage. With a final glance at the banner fluttering lazily above, she walked home, carrying the echo of whispered stories like a soft lantern against the night. In the dim light of the municipal archives, Darius brushed dust from a cracked ceramic jar and uncovered a thin parchment bound with a frayed cord. The scroll's surface was warm from the lingering sun, its fibers whispering faintly as he unrolled them on the stone table. He noted the unfamiliar glyphs, each curve catching the low glow of the oil lamp like a secret breathing in the quiet. Selene, who kept the catalogue of permitted texts, watched from a nearby bench, her hand resting on the cool marble edge. Their combined curiosity felt like a slow tide rising against the stillness of the Republic's imposed silence. The moment lingered, a gentle promise that the past might still speak if only someone would listen. A muffled clang echoed through the vaulted hall as the keepers, enforcers entered, their boots tracing faint patterns on the worn floorboards. Their helmets reflected the amber light, concealing faces behind dim visors that seemed to swallow any hint of expression. Darius tightened his grip on the scroll, feeling the rough cord bite into his palm, while Selene lowered her voice to a measured murmur, describing the edict's latest amendment. The enforcers moved with practiced precision, their steps synchronized like a metronome, marking the Republic's heartbeat. With each measured footfall, the tension in the air grew denser, the scent of stone dust mixing with the faint metallic tang of their armor. Yet the scroll remained cradled between Darius's hands, a quiet defiance against the weight of authority. The trio slipped through a narrow service doorway that led to a maze of low, damp tunnels long forgotten by the city's official maps. The walls, slick with condensation, hummed softly as water dripped into puddles that mirrored the faint lantern glow. Iron bars, once meant to secure secret storages, now served as improvised railings, their rusted surfaces a reminder of bureaucratic oversight that lingered longer than the laws they guarded. Selene chuckled lightly when a sign above a junction read, "Authorized personnel only," despite the absence of any such people for decades. Their footsteps echoed in a rhythm that felt both absurd and inevitable, as if the Republic had unintentionally designed its own labyrinth of silence. The irony lay in how the very mechanisms meant to suppress whispers now guided the seekers toward them. At the tunnel's end, a small alcove opened onto a stone bench warmed by a faint hearth, the fire casting soft, amber shadows across the scroll's faded script. Darius traced each glyph with a fingertip, feeling the slight indentation left by centuries of careful carving, while Selene whispered tentative translations that aligned with the Republic's founding myth, the language spoken of communal listening, of a council that gathered at dusk to share songs rather than enforce edicts, a purpose lost beneath layers of regulation. The fire's crackle provided a steady backdrop, its heat easing the chill that had settled in their shoulders after the chase. As the scroll revealed its hidden narrative, a quiet sense of unity settled over them, as if the ancient purpose was reaching out through the parchment's fibers. Their breathing slowed, matching the gentle sway of the flame, and the moment stretched into a calm that felt both present and distant. Emerging from the tunnels, Darius and Selene returned to the courtyard, where the marble statues of the unreadable prophets loomed under a waning sky. The scroll, now gently rolled, rested against the cool stone, its secrets no longer a threat, but a quiet testament to the Republic's forgotten intention. They placed it beside a modest wooden bench, allowing others who might wander to pause and feel the subtle shift in the air, the faint scent of old parchment mingling with evening breezes. The citizens, accustomed to the hum of enforced quiet, lingered a moment longer, eyes tracing the scroll's outline, as if recalling a lullaby once sung aloud. In the soft hush that followed, there was a shared acknowledgement that history rarely erases itself. It merely waits for steady hands to uncover its size. The day faded into night, and the Republic, still bound by its edict, held within it a silent promise that even whispered truths could linger in the spaces between breaths. The festival of voices swelled across the granite piazza, banners of muted indigo fluttering like cautious birds, while the sun lingered in a soft amber haze. Vendors arranged honeyed figs and warm bread on low tables, the scent of yeast mingling with the distant murmur of a lyre. Selene, her hands clasped around a weathered scroll, walked beside Darius, whose sandals left faint imprints in the dust. The crowd gathered in orderly rows, each face a quiet tableau of curiosity and polite expectation. Above them, the Hall of Echoes waited, its stone arches humming with the faint residue of centuries-long silence. When Selene unfurled the scroll, its ink glistened like spilled ink in low light, and a ripple passed through the assembly as if a breath had been held. Darius lifted his voice, and the words, long forbidden, now spoken, traveled across the stone, touching ears that had only known the keeper's muted decrees. The keeper, cloaked in the same muted indigo as the banners, stepped forward, his robe rustling like dry leaves, and his eyes tightened behind a veil of shadow. Tension thickened the air, a subtle press against the chest of each listener, while murmurs rose in the background, a low tide of dissent and fear. The confrontation escalated without shouts. Each side measured their steps, as if walking on a tightrope of restraint. Amid the stalemate, a child slipped a pebble into a shallow basin, the splash echoing faintly against the hall's vaulted ceiling, drawing a brief, unintentional smile from the keeper as the water rippled. The irony lay in the simplicity of that sound, an innocent splash, louder than the proclamations of authority, reminding everyone that truth can surface in the smallest of gestures. Selene's voice softened, letting the scroll's revelations settle like dust on a bookshelf, while Darius lowered his palms, the tension in his shoulders loosening just enough to feel the breeze. The crowd's collective sigh seemed to synchronize with the distant rustle of olive branches swaying in a late afternoon wind. In that pause, the iron grip of the keeper appeared more a rusted hinge than an unbreakable lock. The showdown concluded with neither a crash nor a chorus, but with a quiet agreement to let the scroll rest upon the central dais, its parchment warm from the sun's lingering heat. People moved back to their stalls, sipping tea that steamed gently, the scent of rosemary mingling with the cool stone floor. The Hall of Echoes absorbed the moment, its walls reflecting a faint amber glow as the lanterns were lit one by one. The keeper retreated to a shadowed alcove, his steps measured, the weight of his robe settling into a familiar, if subdued, rhythm. The festival resumed its flow, a stream of gestures and glances that seemed to acknowledge the newfound openness without breaking its calm cadence. Later, as twilight deepened, and the plaza emptied under a sky brushed with soft lavender, Selene sat on a low bench, her fingers tracing the faint edge of the scroll, feeling the texture of centuries of silence, now interrupted. Darius joined her, sharing a quiet cup of fermented grape, the liquid warm against his palm, and they watched the distant lanterns flicker like fireflies caught in glass. Their thoughts turned to the fragility of spoken truth, how each whispered secret once sealed can, with patience, become part of the everyday hum. The night air held a gentle coolness that brushed against their cheeks, reminding them that history moves forward not in roars, but in the steady cadence of ordinary moments. In that stillness, the Republic seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, aware that the ban on whispers had loosened, not vanished, leaving space for future generations to listen and speak in equal measure. When the council lifted the silent edict, the marble steps of the assembly hall echoed with a soft rustle of parchment as the new covenant was inscribed, permitting whispered truths only within the designated sanctuaries. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, catching the dust that settled like quiet witnesses on the tablets. Selene, whose hair fell in a subdued braid, stepped forward and accepted the mantle of guardian of stories, her eyes hidden beneath a veil of light that left her features indistinct. The proclamation was read aloud in a measured tone, each syllable lingering on the cool stone, reminding the gathered citizens that both silence and speech would now be tended. A modest applause rose, a gentle clapping of palms that seemed more a ritual of acknowledgement than celebration. Yet in the weeks that followed, a subtle tension unfurled among the market stalls, where the scent of toasted barley mingled with the scent of ink. Vendors whispered behind the counter, testing the boundaries of the newly allowed sanctuaries, their lowered voices barely touching the ears of wanderers. A young scribe, fingers stained with ink, hesitated before entering a courtyard shaded by ancient cypress, wondering whether his confession would be heard or dismissed. The air grew cooler inside the stone arches, and the faint murmur of conversations seemed to vibrate against the walls, as if the building itself listened. In the background, the council's bronze bells rang a steady, unhurried cadence, marking time, while doubts lingered like a thin fog. Irony settled into the daily rhythm like a well-worn chair. The very act of whispering once outlawed, now required a passport of permission, stamped by the same hands that had once sealed the lips of the people. Citizens would pause at the threshold of a sanctuary, hand poised over the carved emblem, and smile at the absurdity of needing approval to share a secret about the weather. A baker, flour dusting his apron, chuckled quietly as he recounted the tale of a child who tried to hide a story in a loaf, only to have it rise with the dough. The laughter was soft, its echo barely reaching the high rafters, yet it carried a gentle rebuke to the rigidity of the previous regime. Even the stone statues in the courtyard seemed to tilt ever so slightly, as if to hear the whispered humor that slipped through the cracks of authority. In the evenings, the sanctuaries filled with the low hum of shared memories. Lanterns cast amber pools on worn wooden benches where elders traced the lines of their faces while listening to younger voices. The temperature inside remained steady, a comforting warmth that contrasted with the crisp night outside, and the scent of drying herbs wove through the air like a quiet promise. Selene moved among the listeners, her fingertips brushing the spines of scrolls, ensuring each story found its place without forcing the quiet to become a roar. Children perched on low stools, their eyes half closed, nodded as whispered legends of rivers and distant hills drifted past, each tale folding into the next like layers of a well-kept quilt. The scene unfolded with the patience of a tide, each ripple of voice settling back into calm repose. When the moon rose, silvering the terracotta rooftops, Selene stood at the doorway of the largest sanctuary, feeling the weight of both silence and speech settle into her shoulders. She reflected on how the Republic had learned to cradle its own murmurs, understanding that the act of remembering required both the hush of restraint and the breath of expression. The night wind brushed the stone, carrying the faint echo of a story once suppressed, now softened by the passage of time. In that moment, the guardians sensed a quiet gratitude in the hearts of those who had learned to listen, to speak, and to let the ordinary moments fill the pages of history. The city settled into sleep, its streets hushed but alive with the lingering scent of shared truths, a testament to the enduring balance between what is said and what is left unheard. In the early mist of Lunya Valley, the pale light of sunrise filtered through bamboo groves, brushing the clay roofs of the capital with a soft amber hue. Emperor Zhenwu, still young and eager to leave a mark, stood on the stone balcony of the palace, his robe rustling like dry leaves as courtiers waited in hushed anticipation. He announced, in measured tones, a decree that each night every household should place a single silver coin on their rooftop, as an offering to the moon that seemed to bathe the fields in prosperity. The decree was written on bamboo scrolls, their ink still wet, and distributed by lantern-lit messengers who walked the damp streets. The people listened, their faces a mixture of curiosity and measured resignation, as the first night's moon rose, silver and silent, over the valley. Weeks passed, and the moon's cyclical glow became a quiet rhythm that matched the clink of coins sliding onto stone ledges. Farmers, already bent from the day's toil, would pause at dusk, feeling the cool stone under their fingertips before dropping the small weight, their breath forming fleeting clouds in the night air. Some whispered doubts, noting that the fields showed no sudden increase in yield despite the nightly tribute. Yet the sound of metal against stone persisted like a distant clock. In the markets, merchants counted the growing piles of minted silver, their eyes flickering with both pride and unease, as the weight of the tax settled on their ledgers. The palace's treasury walls, once sparse, now hummed with the soft rustle of countless coins, while the moon above remained indifferent, its pale light unchanged. It was during a particularly quiet night, when a thin veil of fog rolled over the river, that an elderly sage, whose face was always hidden by the shadow of his wide brim, offered a quiet comment to a group of listening youths. He suggested that perhaps the moon was not a furnace for prosperity, but a mirror, reflecting the people's willingness to give, not to receive. The youths laughed gently, their smiles half curtained by the fog, and returned to their homes, still placing the coins, but now with a subtle grin at the absurdity of paying the night sky. The palace officials, hearing the murmur, recorded the anecdote in their annals, noting the slight shift in tone from solemn duty to a softer, almost playful compliance. Even the emperor, observing from his chambers, allowed a faint smile to cross his features, the ironical weight of the decree feeling lighter in his mind. As seasons turned, the rhythm steadied. The nightly offering became as ordinary as the evening fire that crackled in the hearths of each dwelling. Children grew up hearing the soft clink of coins as a lullaby, their hands tracing the cool stone ledges before drifting to sleep under the same moon they had never truly seen. The palace gardens, once meticulously pruned for grandeur, now bore a gentle wildness, the scent of jasmine mingling with the distant echo of coins falling. On clear nights, the silver on rooftops caught the moonlight, casting faint glints that seemed to dance with the wind, creating a quiet tableau of humanity's modest participation in a ritual that had become part of daily life. The kingdom's prosperity, measured in grain stores and quiet smiles, continued without dramatic flourish, sustained by the steady, unremarkable cadence of the lunar tax. In later years, when the empire's chronicles were compiled, Scribes noted the lunar tax not as a moment of grand transformation, but as a gentle lesson in the patience of governance and the subtle power of shared ritual. They recorded that the moon never demanded, only received, and that the people's repeated, unhurried offerings taught a quiet humility that lingered long after the coins stopped clinking. The palace archives, now dusted with time, held the original decree alongside a faded sketch of the moon, its face forever blurred by the soft glow of parchment. Visitors to the Museum of Lunya would sit on worn benches, listening to the faint echo of silver against stone, feeling the cool breath of history settle around them like an evening mist. In the end, the story rested not on wealth or power, but on the calm, enduring cadence of ordinary lives moving together beneath an unchanging sky. In the amber light of early evening, the low stone walls of the granaries glistened with the faint dust of harvest, while distant fields lay quiet under a thin veil of mist. The dynasty that levied a toll on moonlight had, for generations, required each household to surrender a measured portion of their nightly stores whenever the moon rose. Farmers traced the ritual with a practiced hand, measuring barley and tea leaves as the silver disk appeared, while scholars noted the exact moment in their ink-stained ledgers. The air carried the soft rustle of woven baskets and the distant clink of copper coins being weighed. A serene, almost patient rhythm settled over the villages, as if the night itself were an accountant of light and grain. Soon, the steady cadence turned into a quiet ache. The moon's periodic visit began to feel less like a blessing and more like a quiet extraction. By the third week of the harvest, the granaries showed a subtle hollowness, the wooden beams creaking under the weight of missing sacks. Voices rose in hushed complaint at the communal well, where the water now seemed cooler, as though the night had taken a piece of its warmth. The scholars, who once recorded the toll with impartial ink, now whispered over steaming tea, their brows furrowing as they compared ledgers to empty shelves. Even the wind seemed to sigh through the bamboo shutters, carrying the scent of dry earth that hinted at scarcity. Yet no open protest rose, only a collective murmur that lingered like the last note of a bamboo flute. Amid the growing disquiet, Mei Lin, a poet sorceress whose verses were stitched into the very fabric of the night, gathered a small circle of listeners beneath the waning moon. She spoke softly, her words weaving the idea that the moon's light was a gift, not a debt, and that the toll was a misinterpretation of an ancient pact. Her voice brushed the listeners like a cool breeze, and the blurred faces of those present stayed, hidden in shadow, their eyes reflecting the pale glow. The irony lay in the gentle cadence of her claim, which seemed to excuse the very extraction that strained their stores. Yet it offered a comforting narrative that the night was still benevolent. As she recited, the distant croak of frogs and the rustle of night-flying moths created a backdrop that made her tale feel as inevitable as the tide. The guild's rumors spread slowly, like the scent of incense, coaxing villagers to accept the toll with a resigned smile. The village settled into a new equilibrium, the toll now accepted as part of the nightly routine, its weight softened by Mei Lin's verses. Children gathered around hearths, the faint crackle of fire mixing with the low hum of a distant water wheel, while elders traced the moon's path with trembling fingertips on worn maps. The granaries, though lighter, continued to function, their stone walls absorbing the quiet patience of those who tended them. Evening markets buzzed with the muted chatter of traders arranging silk and tea, the air warm with the scent of incense and cooked rice. Even the moon, high and impartial, seemed to pause in its ascent, casting a steady, cool light that brushed the rooftops without haste. In this steadiness, the tension eased, leaving a gentle, almost sleepy acceptance in its wake. Later chroniclers would note the episode as a modest footnote in the dynasty's long scroll, observing how a simple belief could temper a fiscal burden. The stone of the granaries, now soft with age, retained faint impressions of countless hands that once lifted and lowered sacks beneath the same moon. Mei Lin's verses, recorded on bamboo strips, survived the seasons, their ink faded, but still readable by those who sought calm in history's quieter margins. The night, ever impartial, continued its silent watch, its light unchanged, while the people learned to live within its measured glow. In the end, the tale became a quiet reminder that even the most ordinary impositions can be softened by a shared story, and that history, like a well-worn path, often walks beside the slow, steady breath of everyday life. On the 7th night of the waning moon, a thin veil of shadow crept across the capital, the sun's edge softening into an uneven eclipse that the courtiers noted with a quiet sigh. The sky took on a muted gray, and the distant hum of market stalls seemed to dim as vendors paused, their hands still on grain sacks. In the guild hall, the saboteurs gathered around a low table, their lanterns casting amber pools on parchment sketches of the moon, altar's stone columns. Their fingers traced the outlines of hidden bolts and rusted hinges, a quiet choreography of intent. Outside, the imperial palace stood silent, its marble steps cool to the touch, waiting for the darkness to settle like a blanket. When the eclipse reached its deepest point, a hush fell over the courtyard, broken only by the faint rustle of silk robes and the distant clink of a blacksmith's hammer. The guild members slipped through the marble archways, their shoes barely stirring the dust that settled on the polished floor. With deliberate, measured movements, they lifted a silver panel from the moon altar, revealing the dull cold of the stone beneath, and placed a modest weight of soot to dim the reflected light. The air grew heavier, carrying the faint scent of ash that mingled with the lingering incense from earlier rituals. The emperor, seated on his throne, watched the dimming glow with a still face, his eyes hidden behind the shadowed veil of his folded hands. The sudden dimness drew the attention of the palace attendants, whose startled murmurs rolled like soft wind across the stone corridors. Yet their faces remained blurred by the flickering torchlight. As the guild's subtle sabotage unfolded, the emperor's advisors whispered about the folly of relying on moonlight for legitimacy, noting the irony of a ruler whose power waned with a celestial eclipse. A steward, unaware of the covert act, offered a cup of warm tea, the steam rising in lazy curls that seemed to mock the seriousness of the moment. The guild members, seeing the palace's calm response, exchanged a brief, almost amused glance, aware that their protest was as much a performance as a grievance. The muted chorus of the courtiers' feet on the marble floor became a soft percussion, underscoring the quiet absurdity of grand gestures reduced to a simple shade of gray. Soon after, loyalists gathered around the altar, their hands warm from the teacups they had set down, moving with practiced patience to clear the soot and replace the missing panel. The stone surfaces felt smooth under their fingertips, and the soft thud of mallets echoed gently, restoring the altar's familiar silhouette. The palace guards, their armor light as brushed leather, stood at the perimeters, eyes half closed, listening to the distant hum of the market resuming its cadence. The eclipse began to wane, the sun's edge nudging the darkness away, and a pale silver light filtered through, casting elongated shadows that stretched across the courtyard tiles. The atmosphere settled into a steady rhythm, the earlier tension diffusing like steam, evaporating into night air. When the sky cleared, the palace returned to its ordinary pattern of evening sounds. The distant call of a night watchman, the rustle of silk garments, and the occasional laugh of a steward sharing a quiet joke about the night's dimming. Historians later recorded the incident as a modest reminder that even the most elaborate rituals are vulnerable to the simplest of human actions. The guild's subtle interference, while fleeting, left a lingering impression on the emperor's council, prompting a softer approach to honoring tradition without demanding absolute reverence. In the quiet that followed, the stone walls seemed to retain a faint memory of the eclipse, a soft imprint that would be felt only by those who paused long enough to listen. Such moments measured in breaths rather than proclamations, illustrate how history often advances on the gentle edge of everyday imperfections. In the early hush of an amber evening, the palace of the moon told dynasty rested beneath a waning crescent that seemed to pulse with a faint silver chill. Servants moved along the stone corridors, their sandals barely stirring the dust, while lanterns cast a warm orange glow that softened the marble walls. From the high balcony, the Emperor Zhenwu surveyed the gardens, his breath visible in the cool air as distant hills caught the last sigh of daylight. The court's chroniclers had long recorded the imperial edict that the moon's light be measured, stored, and taxed like grain, a policy whispered among scholars as both inventive and absurd. Yet the soft rustle of bamboo leaves carried the ordinary sounds of a kingdom accustomed to the routine of such decrees. And history waited, patient as ever, to note its impact when Mei Lin, a modest overseer of the harvest fields, stepped onto the same balcony. The night wind lifted the hem of her plain cotton robe, revealing a steady resolve beneath her quiet smile. She spoke in a measured tone, her voice mingling with the faint clink of distant temple bells, pleading that true prosperity should rise from the sweat of the people, rather than the abstract capture of moonlight. The emperor, seated on a low throne of lacquered wood, listened while the cool stone brushed against his fingertips, his eyes reflecting the pale glow of the sky. Around them, the night guards shifted their weight, their armor humming softly, as if the palace itself held its breath for the exchange. The tension was palpable, yet restrained, an echo of countless councils where duty met doubt under the same silent veil. Emperor Zhenwu replied with a smile that seemed to mirror the dimness of the moon, noting that the celestial tax was a humble tribute to keep the realm's coffers as full as the river after spring melt. He gestured toward the distant lanterns, their amber flames flickering like fireflies caught in an endless ledger, implying that the collected moonlight funded the repair of bridges and the stitching of silks. Mei Lin, whose hands bore the faint calluses of daily toil, raised an eyebrow, the subtle irony of counting an invisible light not lost on her. Their words drifted like incense smoke, thin and fragrant, filling the balcony with a calm that was both thoughtful and slightly amused at the notion of billing the night sky. In that moment, the palace's grandeur felt ordinary, a backdrop to the human habit of turning mystery into measurement. A gentle hush settled after the exchange, the only sounds the distant croak of a night frog and the soft rustle of silk curtains swaying in the breeze. The emperor's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the moon, now a thin silver thread, slipped behind the mountains. its light cooling the stone steps beneath their feet. Mei Lin turned back toward the courtyard, her steps echoing lightly, and the palace staff resumed their quiet duties, polishing copper vessels and arranging teacups with deliberate slowness. The night air carried a faint scent of jasmine, grounding the lofty debate in the sensory reality of daily life. In this subdued calm, both ruler and subject felt the weight of centuries pressing gently, like a blanket that offered comfort without demanding attention. When the moon finally disappeared, leaving the sky a deep, velvety indigo, the memory of the balcony conversation lingered like the faint afterglow of a candle that had been snuffed. Later chroniclers would note that the dynasty's tribute to moonlight persisted. Yet the people's farms continued to yield grain, their hands still bearing the same honest marks of labor. The story, retold in quiet taverns and modest homes, became a reminder that the most enduring wealth is not measured in celestial taxes, but in the steady rhythm of everyday effort. History, ever patient, kept this lesson folded within its pages, a soft whisper that even the grandest edicts are subject to the simple truths of human work. As the night deepened, the palace lights dimmed, and a gentle sigh seemed to pass through the corridors, sealing the tale with a melancholy that was both solemn and oddly comforting. In the quiet courtyard of the capital, the poet Yuan Long recited verses beneath a waning moon, his voice a soft ripple over the stone tiles. The words lingered like the faint scent of jasmine, describing how the lunar tax had dimmed the night's gentle glow. Villagers listening from the shadowed eaves felt a subtle tightening in their chest, as if remembering the cold weight of unpaid tribute. The Emperor Zhenwu, perched on a low wooden bench, listened with his eyes half closed, the thin curtain of night brushing his cheek. The scene settled into a calm that hinted at change, a pause before the tide of policy would turn. When the council convened the next dawn, the air inside the Jade Hall was thick with the rustle of silk robes and the muted clink of bronze coins. Zhenwu's attendants presented ledgers detailing the dwindling harvests, the tax rolls marked in ink as pale as the moon's reflection on water. A low murmur rose among the officials, a mixture of concern and weary resignation, as the weight of the lunar levy became a palpable presence on the floorboards. The emperor lifted a cup of warm tea, feeling its steam soothe the cramped heat of the room, and his fingertips brushed the rim with deliberate steadiness. The tension lingered like a thin fog, yet his gaze remained fixed on an unseen, blurred silhouette of the poet's memory, suggesting a quiet resolve to alter the old decree. Soon after, a decree was inked with a measured hand, announcing the abolition of the lunar tax and the inauguration of moon festivals. The scribes, accustomed to the rhythm of tax collection, exchanged glances that mixed amusement with bewilderment, as if the moon itself had whispered an unexpected joke. In the market squares, lanterns were strung with simple bamboo frames, their soft light flickering against the faces of merchants who paused their bargaining to watch the gentle glow. Children, their sleeves damp with evening dew, chased each other in circles, their laughter echoing the irony of celebrating a sky once measured in coin. The irony settled into a comfortable hum, a quiet acknowledgement that even the sternest edicts could be softened by a shared smile. As the first festival unfolded, the city exhaled a sigh of relief that drifted through the open gates and settled on the rooftops. The scent of roasted chestnuts mingled with the cool night air, while elders swayed slowly to a lute's mellow chords, their fingers tracing the strings with a practiced ease. Moonlight poured unhindered over the river, painting the water's surface with silver ripples that brushed against the stone bridges. Zhenwu observed from a low balcony, the fabric of his robe rustling softly, his eyes tracing the serene faces of his people, the blurred outlines of his ancestors hidden in the shadows behind him. The scene unfolded with a gentle cadence, each moment a quiet affirmation of harmony restored. When the festival waned and the moon rose higher, the city settled into a lingering quiet, the lanterns dimming one by one like fading thoughts. The emperor retired to his chambers, the wooden floor cool beneath his sandals, and for a moment he let the memory of the poet's verses settle like dust on an old scroll. The night air carried the distant hum of crickets, a subtle reminder of the world's constant, unhurried pulse. In the silence, the people of Lunya felt the weight of history ease, their lives a tapestry, woven with small gestures of gratitude. The final impression lingered like a soft breath, an enduring testament to how a single new light can reshape the ordinary rhythm of a dynasty. In the early light of Lyra's, the river-worn stones of its courtyards caught every syllable as if they were droplets of rain. The city-state had long been famous for its whispering walls, where a single word could travel down a canyon and return threefold. When the council gathered beneath the marble arch of the Hall of Resonance, they announced a new fiscal measure, an echo toll payable for each reverberation that lingered in the stone. The decree was etched on bronze tablets and posted in the market, where merchants paused their bargaining to read the crisp script. For Myra, a low-born scribe whose days were filled with copying ledgers by lamplight, the announcement sounded like a distant reverberation she might someday have to count. The following week, a folded notice arrived at Myra's cramped desk, the ink still warm from the scribe's hand. It listed the exact fee for the echo that had escaped her last transcription, a modest sum of copper shards for each lingering syllable. Myra felt the weight of the stone walls pressing against the thin shutters, as if the very architecture demanded payment for its own memory. She counted the copper carefully, noticing that even the soft rustle of parchment added a faint reverberation to the tally. The clerk at the treasury, a wiry man with soot-stained sleeves, stamped her ledger with a sigh that echoed back off the vaulted ceiling. As the day waned and the market's chatter faded into a low hum, Myra sensed a tightening grip around her voice, a quiet tension that settled like dust on the marble steps. A few days later, the echo collectors arrived, their satchels jingling with the sound of counted reverberations, and their uniforms bore the insignia of a stylized wave caught mid-bounce. They paced the narrow alleys, measuring each footstep against the lingering hiss of distant conversations, as though the very air could be taxed. Ironically, the collectors themselves were required to pay for their own echo, a rule the council had hidden in a marginal note that most citizens never read. When one collector tried to explain the policy, his voice bounced off the stone and produced a second, unpaid echo that lingered stubbornly. The crowd watched the scene with a half smile, the absurdity of a tax on something that could not be held, just as a child watches a kite drift beyond reach. Myra observed from the doorway, feeling the thin thread of humor tug at the edge of her anxiety, as the city's bureaucracy seemed to echo its own ridiculousness. That evening, Myra slipped away from the bustling thoroughfare and entered a narrow courtyard where a single lantern cast amber light on a weathered fountain. The water's gentle splatter muffled the distant tax collectors, and the stone walls, now damp with night mist, swallowed any stray sound. She placed her hand on the cool marble, feeling the faint vibration of an echo that had already been paid for and then forgotten. In the quiet, Myra let her thoughts settle like sediment in a still pond, realizing that some whispers need not be measured, only felt. The city around her breathed a slow, steady rhythm, and for a moment the echo toll seemed as distant as a dream fading at dawn. In the weeks that followed, Myra's entries in the ledger grew shorter, each line a deliberate pause that respected the weight of a sound. She noticed that the citizens of Lyra's began to speak in softer phrases, their conversations threading through the stone like soft footfalls on a carpet. The council, observing the shift, quietly altered the tax tables, allowing a modest exemption for necessary murmurs that sustained the city's trade. Myra reflected on how a simple fiscal edict had reshaped the texture of daily life, turning ordinary speech into a measured art. The city-state, with its whispering walls, continued to echo history, but now the reverberations carried a gentler, more intentional cadence, reminding everyone that even the faintest voice can leave a lasting imprint. Myra walked the cobbled avenues of Lyra's Quay as the late afternoon light filtered through the soot-gray arches, her footsteps echoing against the limestone walls with a muted timbre. The city-state had long imposed a modest tax on every audible reverberation, a charge recorded by the gaunt figures of the resonance wardens who collected copper discs from mouths that dared to speak. She felt the weight of the policy in the way shopkeepers measured their words, pausing before each greeting as if testing a scale. The market stalls, laden with dried figs and cracked pottery, seemed to inhale the silence, their owners wary of the invisible ledger. In the distant square, a child's laugh was quickly hushed by an usher, a reminder that even joy carried a price. One evening, Myra slipped behind the walled courtyard where the wardens convened, the cool stone walls damp with the breath of passing clouds. She watched as a thin ledger was stamped each time a laborer's shouted request for water was intercepted, the clerk's hand moving with a detached efficiency. The poor, whose homes were cramped and their walls thin, lowered their voices to whispers that barely brushed the ears of the guards, their faces tight with fatigue. A sudden clang of a brass bowl echoed, and a warden barked a command, reminding the gathered crowd that unpaid echoes would be silenced by a fine that many could not afford. Myra felt the oppressive hush settle like dust on her shoulders, the air heavy with unspoken pleas. The scene struck her with an uneasy certainty that the city's prosperity rested on the quiet sacrifice of its weakest. It was in the dim back room of an abandoned loot shop that Myra met Kaelin, a lanky musician whose fingers still stained with the faint scent of oil and pine. He smiled with a bored charm, his eyes flickering over a broken string, as if mocking the very notion of a fee on sound. Their conversation unfolded in half-whispers, each syllable measured against the ticking of a low-tuned drum that the wardens had never been able to tax. Kaelin proposed a silent language, gestures and breath, without vibration, an irony so gentle it seemed almost a joke on the authorities who guarded the city's auditory economy. Together they charted symbols on parchment, the ink drying beneath the amber glow of a single oil lamp. The plan felt absurd yet concrete, a quiet rebellion that relied on the very absence of echo to undermine the tax. In the weeks that followed, Myra and Kaelin practiced the silent speech on the riverbank, where the water's low murmur provided a steady backdrop, while their own voices remained still. They exchanged messages with subtle nods, the rustle of their cloaks, and the occasional scrape of a sandal against the pebble path marking the rhythm of their secret dialogue. The resonance wardens passed by, their armor clinking softly, unaware of the invisible conversation drifting between the two. Even the market's muted hum seemed to accommodate this new quiet, as merchants adjusted their stalls to the slower pace of unvoiced barter. The city's pulse softened, its usual tension replaced by a measured, almost sleepy cadence. As the sun set behind the terracotta roofs, Myra stood on the balcony of her modest home, feeling the faint chill of night settle on the stone balustrade. The fee on echoes persisted, yet its grip had loosened. The wardens recorded fewer violations, their ledgers growing thinner like the waning light. Kalen's silent compositions now floated through private chambers, a reminder that sound could be both taxed and liberated alike. The people, though still cautious, began to speak in gestures, their faces calm under the dim lanterns, finding dignity in restraint. History would note this period not for grand battles, but for the subtle shift from enforced clamor to measured hush. In the quiet, Myra understood that human absurdity often resides not in overt rebellion, but in the gentle choice to listen to the spaces between words. At the edge of the riverbank, the stone houses of the city-state of Rezona stood in ordered rows, their terracotta roofs catching the late afternoon sun. Every market square echoed with a soft hum, for even a spoken word left a lingering vibration that the council taxed in measured coins. Citizens learned to speak in brief syllables, their voices dulled by the weight of the echo levy, while the sound keepers, tall men in muted cloaks, collected the fees with a muted clink of copper. Children still played by the well, patting the cool stone and listening to the faint reverberation of their laughter, aware that each giggle added a whisper to the city's ledger. In this measured rhythm, Myra, a weaver with calloused fingers, felt the quiet pull of a story that might someday break the monotony. The rumor arrived on a breezy morning, carried in the whisper of a passing courier who slipped a folded parchment into Myra's loom. It spoke of a hidden well beneath the old aqueduct, a source of echo that flowed freely without charge, like a secret river of sound. As the news slipped from stall to stall, shopkeepers paused mid-trade, ears straining for the faint promise, and the council's patrols gathered on the cobblestones, their boots echoing louder than any taxed word. Fear mingled with curiosity, and a thin crowd gathered in the square, eyes searching the sky for a sign, while the weight of the fee seemed suddenly oppressive. By twilight, the city's rhythm had quickened, each heartbeat sounding like a dissenting note against the imposed silence. The council, intent on preserving its revenue, ordered the aqueduct to be inspected. Yet Its engineers found only damp stone and a faint drip of water. No echo well to be claimed. Ironically, the very act of searching amplified the city's collective murmur. As citizens gathered to watch the officials' lanterns flicker against the darkened arches, Myra watched from the loom's edge, feeling the quiet tug of her own voice as it slipped into the night. Unnoticed, yet uncharged, the patrols, now more numerous, stamped the ground with rhythm that seemed to echo without a fee. A silent protest woven into each footfall. In the end, the hidden well remained a story, its imagined freedom highlighting the absurdity of taxing something as inevitable as a breath. On the following dawn, Myra was led through the narrow alleys to the council's stone chambers, the air thick with the faint scent of wet wool and iron. The guards' lanterns cast long shadows on the walls, where faded symbols of past edicts lay blurred by flickering light. Within the quiet room, a clerk placed a single silver coin on the table, the echo of its clink absorbed by the heavy silence that settled like dust. As she sat on the cold bench, the murmurs of the city outside seemed distant, a soft hum that no longer demanded a price. In that stillness, Myra felt the weight of her rebellion not as anger, but as a measured responsibility, the realization that a rumor, however harmless, could disturb the fragile balance of a community used to its own muted cadence. Later, as the sun slipped behind the western hills, Myra was released back onto the market steps, a modest scarf draped over her shoulders. The city's ambient echo, now a softened sigh. She watched the children resume their muted games, the sound keepers counting coins with a slower, almost contemplative rhythm, as if each tally carried a memory of the brief unrest. The rumor of the free well had faded, yet its echo lingered in the quiet conversations of neighbors who now chose their words with a hint of tenderness. Myra's hands, still bearing the faint imprint of the stone bench, traced the pattern of the loom's threads, remembering that rebellion can be as gentle as a single thread pulled from a tapestry. In the waning light, the city settled into its habitual hush, and the fee on echoes persisted, a reminder that even the softest resistance is measured against the slow, patient pulse of history. At the foot of the terracotta walls of Lyrates, the city-state that collected a modest fee for every echo, the citizens marked the calendar with a quiet reverence. Each year, on the first cold morning of spring, the Echo Festival began with lanterns lit low, their amber glow reflecting off the copper plates of the toll booths that measured reverberations. Myra, a young clerk whose hands had learned the rhythm of tallying the soft return of voices, stood by the central courtyard, watching the stone arches hold the distant murmur of gathered crowds. The great bell, hung above the market square, was polished to a dull sheen, waiting to be struck only when the final toll had been recorded and the taxes balanced. People whispered in measured tones, aware that each reverberation would turn the small gears of the tax devices, a reminder that even sound was not free. The air was cool, carrying the scent of fresh bread and the faint metallic taste of morning, and the city settled into the patient rhythm of its own tradition. The ceremony commenced as the first volunteers sang a low chant, their voices climbing the vaulted hall, and the toll devices began to click in gentle succession. Myra, feeling the weight of the ledgers on her shoulders, adjusted the calibration knob, unaware that the resonant frequencies were aligning beyond the usual range. A sudden gust from the open gate swept across the courtyard, stirring the dry leaves and amplifying the collective hum into a low thrumming that vibrated the stone steps. The resonance grew, and the brass plates of the echo meters flickered erratically, their needles dancing like startled birds. Soon the sound pressed against the great bell, whose bronze rim began to shiver under the pressure of the unanticipated surge. The city's calm gave way to a tense murmur as the toll collectors exchanged uneasy glances, the quiet anticipation turning into a palpable tension that hummed through the air. The unexpected climax arrived when the bell, strained by the overloading echo, emitted a sharp crack that split the morning light like a pane of thin glass. Instead of the solemn toll that marked the end of the festival, the sound shattered into a chaotic cascade, scattering reverberations into every alley and market stall. The echo tax devices, designed to capture each reverberation, sputtered and ground to a halt, their gears grinding as though sighing at the absurdity of being outpaced by their own subjects. Citizens paused mid-conversation, eyes widening at the sight of the cracked bell, its fissure glinting amber against the worn stone. In that moment, the tax that had governed their speech seemed as fragile as the broken metal, and the city-state's proud decree crumbled under the weight of its own echo. A quiet laugh slipped through the crowd, not of ridicule, but of weary recognition that the system had been outdone by the very thing it tried to own. As the last fragments of sound faded, a soft wind brushed over the square, carrying the scent of cooling metal and the faint taste of ash from the bell's scar. Myra lowered her hand from the tangled cords, feeling the smooth coolness of the brass frame and the steady pulse of the stone beneath her feet. The toll collectors gathered the idle ledgers, their pens resting on quiet tables as they recorded the day's unexpected outcome with a measured calm. Children returned to their games, their laughter now muted, while the market vendors resumed arranging loaves and jars, the ordinary rhythm of life reasserting itself. Even the great bell, though cracked, stood resolute, its silence becoming a new kind of reverence that settled over Lyrades like a gentle dusk. In the weeks that followed, the council deliberated over the broken tax, noting in their minutes that a city could not imprison the pulse of its own people. The echo fee was quietly repealed, the devices dismantled, and the stone arches were left to hear only the natural hum of wind and footfall. Myra kept a small piece of the bell's bronze in a pocket, its cool weight a reminder that imperfection can be both a fracture and a source of quiet beauty. Elders spoke of the incident in low tones, their faces softened by the fading light, aware that history often records the loudest events through their lingering hush. The citizens learned to speak with a little more care, not out of fear of a levy, but out of respect for the fragile resonance that binds a community together. And so Lyrades moved forward, its streets echoing with ordinary steps, each footfall a modest tribute to the lesson that even a cracked bell can still mark time. In the low stone halls of Lyras, officials once hung copper plates that measured the reverberation of each spoken word, charging a small coin for every echo that lingered in the marble corridors. The citizens, accustomed to the hum of market stalls and the clink of coin, learned to speak in measured whispers, feeling the weight of each syllable as it brushed against the walls. Myra, a scribe with ink-stained fingertips, noted the quiet trade in the city square, where merchants offered discounts for sentences that kept their echoes short. Children played a game of silent tag, their footsteps muffled on the cobblestones, as the echo tax kept the streets unusually calm. The atmosphere held a patient stillness, as if the whole city were holding its breath beneath the pale light that filtered through the high windows. As the months passed, the fee began to collect not only coins, but a sense of restraint that settled like dust on the public fountains. Traders whispered complaints in narrow alleys, their voices catching on cracked plaster, and the sound of discontent echoed faintly despite the tax. Myra observed a growing line of weary faces waiting outside the echo office, where a clerk stamped each returning reverberation with a cool metal seal. The tension was palpable when a group of singers, their throats tight, gathered in the courtyard to petition for relief, their rehearsed verses stifled by the lingering metallic clang of the fee ledger. The city's stone walls seemed to absorb more than sound that day, holding a low hum of unspoken frustration that brushed the skin of those who passed by. Ironically, the very attempt to control resonance sparked a market for counterfeit echoes, as clever artisans crafted wooden chambers that swallowed sound and released it only after the fee had been paid. a baker began selling free echo loaves, each bite accompanied by a muffled sigh that slipped through the tax net, and customers laughed softly at the absurdity of buying silence. The echo office, burdened with paperwork, started counting empty receipts, while the city's rhythm grew punctuated by the occasional burst of unintended reverberation from cracked pipes. Myra recorded these odd transactions in a leather-bound journal, noting how the citizens learned to laugh at the bureaucratic echo, turning the fee into a private joke whispered behind the market stalls. By dusk, the streets resonated with a gentle chorus of unintended sounds: clattering pots, a stray dog's bark, each a reminder that the attempt to tax reverberation only amplified the human pulse beneath the stone. With the realization that the echo tax had become a source of quiet rebellion rather than order, Lyra's council convened beneath the warm glow of oil lamps and voted to dissolve the fee. The copper plates were lowered, their metal clinking softly as they fell onto the mosaic floor, and a hush settled that felt less like suppression and more like invitation. Citizens stepped out into the square, their voices unfurling naturally, letting stories ripple over the fountain without the fear of a ledger's tally. Myra, now appointed archivist, arranged parchment scrolls on a simple wooden table, allowing the ambient chatter to become the background of her work rather than a taxed commodity. As the night settled, a gentle breeze carried the distant hum of a lute, and the city breathed in synchrony, the walls finally resonating with the uncharged cadence of ordinary life. In the weeks that followed, Myra compiled the modest chronicles of the echo tax, her ink tracing the subtle arc from restraint to release with a measured hand. She noted how the people of Lyra's learned that listening, not levying, gave their streets a richer texture, each footfall and sigh adding depth to the communal song. The archivist's quiet voice, recorded in the amber of parchment, now serves as a gentle reminder that regulation of the most fleeting things often leaves behind only the memory of a muted clunk. As she seals the last scroll with a wax stamp, the soft click echoes faintly, not as a fee, but as a sign of completion, inviting future generations to hear the ordinary without demand. The city rests beneath a calm sky, its stones warm from the day's sun, and the story of the fee on echoes drifts like a soft lullaby, teaching that true harmony resides in the spaces between spoken words.